Hello, my name is Jonathan Mususa, and I am a senior studying multimedia journalism at Virginia Tech. For the past few months, I have been looking into the current state of local television news in an era of crisis for local news in general. How local television compares to other mediums, how recent developments have impacted its effectiveness, what role nonprofits could play, so on and so forth. To find answers, I sought the insights of academics and researchers in this field. Here's how that went. In my first and most wide-ranging interview for this project, I spoke to Robert Papper, research professor of broadcast and digital journalism at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. He has also been running the Radio, Television, Digital News Association's annual Business of TV News Survey, which gives him a unique insight into the state of the local news industry. Over the course of our conversation, we touched on quite a bit. Here are some highlights. Within the current local news landscape, Papper said that local TV is rather important, though it is not without its limits.
Well, it plays a pretty critical role, especially as we do lose newspapers. Um, Television stations cover pretty much every inch of this country, and provide at least some measure of news for a metropolitan area. Um, it's not going to provide a lot of news and information for small towns. I mean, it's small towns and outlying communities in a large metropolitan area are going to get coverage only if something extraordinary happens, for the most part, and so it's not the ultimate solution.
Then he mentioned that, despite decreasing viewing figures and the perceived threat of digital platforms, the local TV news industry is in fairly okay shape.
There are fewer people watching TV, local TV news, watching TV news generally, than there used to be. And people, especially young people, are getting more and more news from the internet. Now, the question is who's supplying that news that's on the internet? Now, to the extent that that news ultimately comes from local newspapers and local TV stations, then those people are probably doing fine. To the extent that they're getting it from random people who believe more in conspiracies than in news, that's a problem. Um, but even as we see the news audience, I mean, TV news is easily the number one supplier of legitimate local news and information in this country by a long shot, at this point. Um, but its audience is shrinking and its audience is aging. And both of those things are true. Now, is television on the verge of going out of business? No, it's not. Um, we're seeing very small attrition in terms of TV stations doing local news. We're seeing a little bit, but for the most part, some of the weaker players across the country uh, are having problems. But ironically, even as we lose a couple newsrooms every year, and that's give or take what we're seeing these days, local TV news is overall running on more stations than it ever has. We have never had local TV news on as many stations as we do today. Fewer stations are producing that news, but they're running that news on more TV stations than ever before. So there's certainly plenty of opportunity for people to be informed. Um, how much they take advantage of it is another issue. But they're taking advantage of it enough that you know we don't have a lot of TV stations on the verge of bankruptcy. We probably don't have any TV stations on the verge of bankruptcy unless some idiot owner paid way, way, way too much for the station to begin with.
Later, the conversation shifted to public television and where it fits in and could fit into the local news landscape, especially in the wake of the defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. While he had expressed some uncertainty about the viability of other forms of nonprofit media, the picture he painted of PBS's situation was markedly less than rosy.
Public TV is in real trouble, in my view. Now, part of it, I think, is something they've done to themselves. Um, they could use, they could have used federal funding and money that they've raised to support local news efforts and experimentations in covering local news and information in their communities. They chose not to do that. What PBS has chosen to do is to put a lot of money. They put a lot of money into kids programming, and that's terrific, and that would be a huge loss if that disappears. But they've also chosen to put a huge amount of money into PBS NewsHour. And my question is, why? I mean, that's where they spend a lot of their money, is in putting together a nightly newscast that, compared to commercial television, CBS, NBC, and ABC, the audience for PBS NewsHour is 5% of the total. I mean, nobody watches it. And the fact is that the audience has said that the commercial networks do a pretty good job covering national and international news. And I think PBS has made a huge mistake in spending as much money as they do, uh, duplicating and putting together a product that the American public has said they're not really interested in.
Finally, he ended by saying that, despite how things may seem, local television news would likely end up in a good place in the near future, though it would have to weather great changes.
That sounds fairly, you know, gloom and doom, and that's coming across too much that way, because local news is important to people. Uh, People are much more interested in local news than they are in national or international news. That's not true for young people. Young people don't have an attachment to the community, so they're more likely to follow national and international news if they follow news at all. But older people, people who are homeowners who have families and so on, their attachment is to the local community, and local news is important, and it's not going to disappear, and someone's going to supply that news. Um, People are going to get it online via streaming, um, but that doesn't tell us who's supplying it or who's producing it. And I think um, that that's likely to be on an overall basis, that's likely to be the local TV stations and a smaller group of newspapers um, that exist with a smaller and smaller staff. Um, they're not going to disappear completely, but they're definitely in trouble, and you know, more and more of them will go online, and they'll raise money as best they can.
And now, a few extra thoughts on public media, from two experts, each with their own unique perspective on this issue. First, I talked to Christopher Ali, Pioneers Chair in Telecommunications at the Belisario College of Communications at Pennsylvania State University. Having researched media localism in the past, he's recently shifted his research focus to broadband and other telecommunications-related issues. However, he was still passionate about the role that public media plays in society.
I mean, public service media, I think I like Bob McChesney's definition the best, where it's the non-commercial alternative to um, commercial media that is meant to see its viewers and audience members as citizens and never as consumers. To provide the type of content that mainstream media, that commercial media tends to bypass as being, you know, not profitable. I continue to think about it as a very old school definition of public media, but I'm still very much, we've still very much need a non-commercial, um, I don't want to say complement, but corrective to what is otherwise what Newt Minow called the vast wasteland of commercial television.
In response to some of Papper's criticisms of PBS, Ali accepted that public television needed an increased emphasis on local content, but rejected what he felt was a call to make public television play by commercial television's rules.
Public broadcasting should not be weighed against the metrics of the market. That's the entire basis of public broadcasting. And to force public broadcasting to speak the language, the logics of the commercial market is expecting it to fail. That is not at all the point of public broadcasting. I agree with the professor that you quoted in that not enough stations are producing local news. I did a study that eventually was quoted in the 2011 FCC Waldman report that found that only 14 out of the 260 plus stations, or 360 plus stations, sorry, of PBS were actually doing regular local news. So, you know, PBS was the local stations were founded on the basis of localism, but many of them, most of them, the majority of them are not actually contributing the local conversation. That is indeed a misstep. But we should not be holding PBS or any non-commercial broadcaster or any non-commercial media outlet to the standards of the commercial market.
Next, I interviewed Howard Husick, who spent time as a journalist at leading public television station WGBH in Boston before working at the American Enterprise Institute, a right-leaning think tank where he is a senior fellow in domestic policy studies. His argument is that public television, public media in general, should reorient itself away from the traditional model of nationally syndicated programming toward the kind of in-depth, watchdog coverage of local government that commercial local TV often lacks the interest to cover.
It's not enough to replay the PBS NewsHour, to show Frontline or other national series, Downton Abbey, Live from Lincoln Center. News and entertainment consumers, customers, are now able to get that. The phrase in the media world is over the top. They can get it on their smartphones through the NPR or PBS apps. They don't need the local station, quote unquote, anymore. Though for them to survive and thrive, they're going to have to carve out a new role for themselves that their local customers deem it appropriate to support financially. And that means they have to produce local and regional content, a big part of which should be local and regional journalism, because there's a market for it, possibly among the local elites, but that's okay. That's how democracy sometimes works. And maybe it's broad-based, but they need to plumb the financial wherewithal of their localities and understand that unless they produce original content, some of it's video, some of it's audio, some of it's both, they're not going to have a reason to exist anymore. So they have local public media licensees, that's the word I like to use, have a kind of an existential crisis, and they have to be able to produce content that has a constituency that will support them financially.
This podcast was produced alongside a research paper about local television news and the local news crisis, written under the supervision of Virginia Tech School of Communications instructor Jared Woolley. This has been Jonathan Mususa. Thank you for listening.